Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. S.Friedman is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher, artist, scientist, and a great speaker of ours. We would like to thank Stephen for joining us weekly and giving the philosophical talks. And also, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please stay active. Give your comments and your feedback. Ask questions in the messages, in the comments, and we will definitely reply them. And also, the topic for today's talks is the blame game. Thank you very much, Stephen. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction. As always, thank you very much for moderating the talks and helping make them possible every week. I also want to thank the U.S. Consulate in Almaty, Dana, Elmira, and the entire staff that does facilitate these weekly presentations of philosophical perspectives on a wide range of topics. Now, often I am keying the talks to specific international days, other times, major events. I've given talks in relation to the US elections, for example. This week's talk is motivated primarily by some current events, some conflicts, in particular, the conflict in Afghanistan and its denouement, the withdrawal of American and NATO forces from the conflict after 20 years. These are not politically motivated talks. These are talks designed to give a philosophical perspective. And so the comments that I'm going to be making about, conflict, about war, about some of the realities, of those situations apply to all conflicts, all engagements where cultures encounter each other, where there are tensions, where there are possibilities of violence. So philosophy is always operating from the highest possible perspective. The generality that philosophy assumes in assessing circumstances is also the limit of rigor. Now, that's a difficult notion that would basically could be the subject of its own talk, that the limit of generality is the limit of rigor. But it's a principle, it's an aphorism. And the most important aspect, though, is that what philosophy has to say in general applies to everything. So as we talk about different types of conflict, we're talking about all conflict in principle. Now, that's the main topic for tonight, but I wanted to introduce the talk with actually an aphorism that I wrote today. It's not unusual for me to write an aphorism, but aphorisms are not things that I seek to write. They are formulations that come to me in relation to what I may be thinking about. The aphorism will distill the sequence of thoughts, the ideas that I'm having. When an aphorism does come to me, it has to be written down almost immediately, because if any delay can introduce a subtle change even in a preposition, and that will undercut the power and the significance, of the aphorism. There are times when aphorisms will occur to me in the middle of the night. I have to have a phone nearby to write them down or transcribe them, or paper and pencil in order to transcribe them immediately. Otherwise, if I try to rely upon my memory, to take me to the morning with that thought, with that formulation, again, it often fails at the point of a given word, a given preposition, and I lose the intensity of the thought. Well, the aphorism that I wrote today is: the novelty of death is epistemic, of Eden. Now, it's the subject of that aphorism is death. We're talking about today war, conflict. Death, unfortunately, is often a component of such engagements, such human enterprises. It doesn't have to be, in principle. According to Sun Tzu, the supreme art of war is to achieve victory without fighting, something close to the spirit, the impulse of diplomacy. But in actuality, death, violence is common, right, in wars presently throughout history. But that particular aphorism was inspired, motivated by something else. I found out late yesterday that my best friend in high school, in college, in graduate school, in my early years of doing art, in my earliest years of writing philosophy, had died. Now, it turns out we had been disconnected, for a number of years under circumstances that I still can't fully account for. There was a slight gap when we were not in contact, and when I, about a year later, tried to reestablish contact, I couldn't find him. And this was some years ago, before the internet had achieved its present capabilities. So it was more difficult to find somebody. They could vanish more easily. Well, it turns out ultimately that the reason I was not able to find this friend of mine, I discovered yesterday, was that he had died. I don't know the circumstances. I'm trying to find out. But so for me, today, death was in the air. This was the first day when I awakened to his absence, his knowing, my being aware of his absence from the world. And not being in contact with somebody is a very different experience psychologically than knowing that that person is deceased. When my mother died, my father was disrespectful to her memory. And for the official year of mourning, I did not talk to my father. And I told him that I was going to, keep my distance. But at the end of that year, I reestablished contact. And some years later, he did die. But what I discovered was that the experience of not being in contact with somebody who's otherwise alive is fundamentally different, profoundly different than the experience of losing them to death. So, when I would say to people, well, I don't have any family, they would say to me, well, I have family, but I'm not in contact with them. I would explain, well, that's really not the same. It goes back to the essential point that philosophy is always emphasizing, the Shakespearean point, all teach you differences, right? When we're doing philosophy, every difference matters. That's the nature of the philosophical enterprise. That's the nature of the rigor that informs philosophy. And unfortunately, death was in the air for me today. And, this talk was motivated by some events in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, death was in the air today there. So, and what comes to my mind often, aside from philosophical aphorisms, is poetry. My poetry is often written not in response to, but in acknowledgement of the tragic sense of life, the issues, the challenges that life presents. My philosophical work attempts to resolve those challenges, answer them. But the very first poem I wrote many years ago was actually about death, and it was inspired by Emily Dickinson, who is my favorite poet. I consider her, as great a poet as any culture has produced. The poem that I wrote was very short. Death is not vacuity. It has its forms, I know. Shadow of pearl, light of amber, over the rim of gall. That was my work, inspired by the basic mood, rhythmic patterns of Emily Dickinson's work. Today, that poem was going through my mind, but also a poem by Emily Dickinson herself. And I'll recite that poem too. There is a finished feeling experienced at graves, a leisure of the future, a wilderness of sighs. By death's bold exhibition, precise are what we are, and the eternal function enabled to infer. Okay, so that's my introduction, inspired by these personal events of the last couple of days, and also, what's happening internationally. Now, in terms of the blame game, what specifically motivated this week's talk was media accounts, press conferences that I was watching, listening to, in response to events this past week in Afghanistan as part of the US withdrawal from that campaign that has lasted 20 years. There were reporters, journalists, asking often generals, questions critically, commenting, even with some hostility, on strategy and approach. And what came to my mind was that I wished one of these generals would respond, "We are people, not wizards, but if you happen to be a wizard, please apply for service, especially if you're clairvoyant and can see clearly into the future." That obviously is a capacity that no human being has, that circumstances are always rigorously distinct, one to the next. And the complexity of circumstance is such that nothing can rigorously be anticipated. There were other articles. There was an article I read in a newspaper saying that we had been in Afghanistan for 20 years, or the war had lasted, this current conflict had lasted 20 years, but the media is rushing to assign blame within 2 hours. So that was the perspective that was motivating my response. And the aphorism that came to mind is, we suffocate under premature senses of reality. Philosophy lets us breathe again. That we're always rushing to conclusions, premature assessments. In a sense, every assessment is premature. The future decides the past, decides the reality. We suffer that we presume more than we know, as if there were no time. We suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. So, philosophy is grounded in a humility of what we can legitimately know versus what is beyond the rigor of our circumstances. When it comes to war, conflict, the first maxim, the first principle of war taught in military colleges is no plan survives the encounter with the enemy. No plan. Okay? That's something we think that our plans, our are so well designed, so well conceived that they can't possibly let us down. But that's a naive view. That's an inexperienced view. People that are experienced with the complexities of war, the complexities of conflict, know a plan is just a reasonable guess for how to proceed reasonably, but always is going to be subject to modification on the battlefield in the course of its being executed. Right? And that goes back to that fundamental, that primal philosophical joke. How do you make God laugh? Make a plan. Right? So it's not just something that is taught at military colleges. It's not just something that every experienced military officer, every general, every planner, of strategy, of engagement is aware of. It's something that is central to philosophic understanding of, again, the fundamental nature of our circumstances. Want to make God laugh? Make a plan. Plans are heuristics. Heuristics are instruments to achieve certain ends or certain goals, right? I make the fundamental distinction between epistemics and heuristics. Epistemic space, philosophic space, rigorous space, and heuristic space. The space of science and technology and society and political life and planning. The space of language, where any two things are approximately the same. Rigorous space, epistemic space, philosophic space, those are all synonyms, is a space in which any two things are rigorously distinct. The fundamental nature of the epistemic and epistemic proposition, and in fact, when encountering a proposition, the most important thing to ask oneself is it epistemic? Is it heuristic? Those are the two fundamental categories for characterizing the nature of our representations, our propositions about the world. If something is epistemic, if a proposition is epistemic, it's not debatable. If something is heuristic, it's not validatable. That's philosophy in essence, right? That sort of sums up, where we stand relative to rigor, the epistemic, relative to everything else that we cannot be rigorously informed as to the outcome. We cannot know in advance. We might engage in a plan, we might introduce a plan that we have high levels of confidence in, but we cannot know. And that's the fundamental characteristic of everything that's not epistemic, that's not at the limit of philosophical rigor, like propositions such as two things are not one, right? The kind of thing that undercuts controlled experimentation. We see it, for example, on a daily basis in sports. Probably around the world, one of the major interests, preoccupations of people is sports betting. It's certainly become commonplace in the United States, and I think it was more common elsewhere before it became as popular in the last few years. It's been more legalized in the last few years here. So betting on every type of sport, baseball, football, like American sports, betting internationally on soccer, international football, even betting on what are considered more niche sports like tennis or golf is like fundamental to many people's preoccupations. Well, betting on sports is an institution because the outcomes cannot be known in advance, right? Whatever the competition is, there is sufficient uncertainty that betting becomes a possibility, a possible enterprise. If there were certainty at any level, well, the people that were offering the bets would go broke, right? They would lose because the people that were making the bets would know the outcome. We are not ever in that position. If we're not in that position relative to games, we're certainly not ever in that position relative to conflict and war, where there are so many more elements. But it doesn't matter. In any situation, a tennis match, a badminton match, a golf tournament, a golf hole, there are enough variables that the outcome is always, in principle, unknowable. Right? It's heuristic. We're engaged in a heuristic enterprise. We cannot know for sure. Right? When we're dealing with heuristic situations where there is no rigor, there is no incontrovertibility, we cannot know that a given result will be true incontestably, right? That's the domain of philosophy. That's the domain that achieves, again, what religions have aspired to as modes of salvation. But everything else that's heuristic helps us survive. Right? Helps us predict the weather, helps us design our technologies, right? Where the products that we're creating are not identical, are approximately equal, right? But not rigorously so. The domain of the rigorously distinct is the philosophic. Well, if we're in the heuristic domain, we are dealing with the governing functionality, as I call it, of convergence. Right? Epistemic space is a divergent space. Things are distinct and distinguishable. They separate from each other. And their separations are fundamental to what makes it rigorous. The heuristic space is a convergent space. And to achieve a given goal, a given result, whether it's the design of a product, whether it's human personal fitness, whether it's the body of a bodybuilder, whether it's the skills of a world-class athlete, or whether it's victory in conflict or in war, the result is achievable heuristically by some order of convergence, by bringing together a sufficient number of elements. That's the basic principle of heuristic space. We can't know in advance that a given result will be achievable by any number of elements that we bring together, but the fundamental heuristic principle is at some level of convergence, some number of elements possibly ordered in some way. And that ordering is what we call a plan. So when we are designing strategies, in warfare, we are bringing together numbers of troops, of artillery, of weaponry, of technologies, of a whole host of ingredients that then are ordered in terms of a strategy that we hope will achieve the result, the goal that we aspire to. Okay? That's true for any goal-oriented enterprise. Remember I said at the beginning, what I'm saying applies not just to conflict, not just to war, it applies to everything. Everything that has a goal as its end. Okay? And everything that has a goal is heuristic. And that goal is achievable by some ordering and by some multiplying of the number of elements. You say, well, how do you know? Well, we can't know, right? We're dealing with heuristic space. All we can do is keep trying, right? Try harder. Add more elements, do more repetitions of weights, whatever it is, right? That we think might help The more we do of that thing, the more we order it. We might have to order it differently. The ordering is itself a convergent element that we are adding to a situation to achieve a result. The more elements we add, the more likely we are to achieve a strong result. When you look at World War II, for example, and look at the strategies of the Allies, the strategies that were conceived by leaders like Churchill, they didn't do 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things. They did 1,000 different things. They were, like Churchill himself was focused upon oratory, speeches to motivate people, right? He was a master orator. That was an essential component of what ultimately contributed to victory. In addition, there was massive buildup of troops, massive manufacturing of all varieties of weapons. There were new technologies that were relied upon, like radar, had been introduced and was largely perfected in the course of World War II. There was a focus on espionage, a focus on deception. It was said by Sun Tzu that all war is deception. Every plan that was introduced during World War II had a corresponding deception associated with it to try to misdirect the focus of the enemy. In the case of Maradona, I've talked about this in the past, the soccer player, the legendary soccer player, he described the key to his success as deception, that he would be running in one direction, trying to get the pursuer to anticipate his move and go off in a different direction, thwarting that anticipation. That's a mode of deception. It's that sort of thwarting of expectation is the nature of human. That's what a joke does. We talked about that not too long ago. That's the key to salvation, that freedom from the prison of expectation that the past imposes upon us, that philosophy rigor frees us from. So we're using lots of elements, right, to achieve success. There were code breakers in World War II. There was propaganda. There was an endless, every time I sort of read an article or something about World War II, I encounter some new strategy, some new component, that was in play that I was never aware of. Every single time I read an article, there was that much complexity to the operation, which means there were that many convergent elements that were brought into play to achieve victory. Now, there's an aphorism of mine that summarizes that. It's numbers govern contingency. Contingency is the course of events, what actually happens. It's basically an outcome in heuristic space. The achievement of a goal, let's say, would be a contingent result, something that depends upon something else. Numbers govern contingency in that the more elements we put together, the more reliably we achieve a given result. That's actually, that principle, that aphorism, numbers govern contingency, is actually a generalization of thermodynamics, which is a branch of physics, of science, that Einstein embraced as the one area of science that he thought would be left standing at the end of time, because he thought its principles were so fundamental and unassailable. Numbers govern contingency is an aphorism that I actually incorporated into one of my artworks. And I just wanted to illustrate that process, just to amplify what I'm saying here. Now, here is a close-up. I'm going to show this. I didn't send this to Aaliyah. I'm just going to show it to you now. This is a close-up of a set of poles. Let's see if you can see that. Okay. Now, those poles are actually, that's only a section of the work. Notice, if you counted them, there are 6 poles there. The actual poles are 8 feet long, so very long. They're poles you can actually see behind me over there, leaning against the wall. They contain images, like you see in this pole. Now, if you notice, if you look, and I think you might be able to see here, the top 2 images here are black and white. All the other images are multicolored, okay? What I'm doing in these poles is embedding the aphorism, transcribing the aphorism into Braille, and then painting that Braille transcription into the poles. So the poles are both abstract and communicative of a given, in the case of those poles behind me, a given aphorism or set of aphorisms. I've done entire books embedded into poles, transliterated into Braille. And to show you how that works, just to give you a sense of what the Braille is, this right here represents the letter B. Now, in general, in Braille, there are 6 positions. I think you might be able to see over here. Now, like I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2 of these circles are filled in. There are another 1, 2, 3, 4 circles. I think you might be able to see it's kind of faint, unfortunately, not filled in. When you have 6 positions like that, 2 filled in and the other blank, that's the letter B. It can be written like this, where they're side by side. It can be written in a row. The first 2 here are filled in. The next 4 are blank. That's how you represent the letter B. Each letter can be represented as some pattern of these 6 either filled in dots or blank spaces. Well, what I do in the poles is my black and white images represent the dots of Braille, and the multicolored images represent the open circles. So you read the Braille as the black and white images, and that's how you read the aphorisms in those poles. Numbers govern contingency. And that's the fundamental principle of heuristic space. It's also the fundamental principle of thermodynamics, that the more numbers of things coalescing, converging, the stronger the object achieved. Now, we get different kinds of outcomes depending upon what's coming together, right? Sometimes we get strong, stable objects. Sometimes we get powerful explosions, right? When people were designing atomic bombs, they were bringing together pieces of uranium, pieces of plutonium. They were squeezing them together, achieving a convergence that achieved a sustained nuclear reaction that generated enough energy to explode. That's a product of convergence too, right? Convergence but that is sometimes what we want, right? When we are sort of building bridges and establishing like railroads and highway systems, dynamite, was like the main instrument, of that engineering process. So an explosion is not necessarily a negative thing, right? It can be harnessed for purposes that serve desirable ends that are not in principle destructive, but are constructive ends. Okay? But the point is that convergence can achieve all kinds of different results depending upon the nature of the elements that we're bringing together, their number, their ordering. Okay? The The fundamental principle, though, is no matter what we're talking about within a heuristic space, no matter how many elements we're bringing together, no matter how many strategies we are conceiving of during World War II, we cannot be certain of victory, right? We can't be certain of the outcome because, again, fundamentally, we're not in epistemic space, we're in heuristic space. Remember, the fundamental question to ask about anything, is it epistemic? Is it heuristic? If it's epistemic, it's certain, it's incontrovertible, it's rigorously true. If it's heuristic, it is not validatable. It may achieve an object, but we can't know in advance. And even if it achieves the object under one set of conditions, it may not achieve that result the next time we try. You know, it's often been said that one of the mistakes in warfare is to fight the next war with the strategies of a past one, right? Because conditions have changed. Things are always evolving. That's the nature of our experience of time. So, and that's why the heuristic is not capable of telling us in advance for sure what the outcome will be. It applies, to everything we do. It applies to sports. It applies to sports betting. It applies to conflict. It applies to war. It applies to evacuations. It applies to removing troops from Afghanistan, removing civilian populations. Whenever we're dealing with something that is attempting to achieve a goal, we can do our best. We cannot know for sure because that activity is taking place within heuristic space where there is, by definition, no certainty. Because every set of circumstances is new in some and actually in an infinite number of ways, ultimately. We do our best, right? The main issue is whether we are ill-intentioned or not, right? If we are ill-intentioned in trying to thwart a given outcome or achieve an outcome that is not desirable or embraceable, well, that's another matter. Right? But if we are well-intentioned, we can never be absolutely sure, right? And again, when we're dealing with conflict, when we're dealing with war, whatever the plan is that we formulate will not likely survive the encounter with the enemy, right? We always have to be adapting. We always have to be changing things to conform to circumstance. It's why you make the point that as much as I plan these talks out in advance, things happen that change aspects of the talks, maybe change. Now I'm trying to keep them more formatted according to the original outline and design, because I think it's easier for people working with me. Certainly easier for Leah when I do that. So I'm trying very, very much now to maintain, the sequence that I originally conceived, but I always get new ideas and I'm always incorporating them because it achieves a better result. Well, you have to do that always in sports, in war, in conflict, always changing to conform to the new circumstance that presents itself. Right? Again, not epistemic, not a rigorous space, a heuristic space. War, in particular, conflicts of that sort, do not present clarity. They certainly do not present clarity in the course of, in the middle of the working out of the conflict. The sense that we should be able to engineer a given result is really that fundamental misunderstanding of the world, that sense that when we are planning, when we're envisioning things, we are, as it were, seeing the world from the outside, right? We think of reality in that way, We think of reality as what exists independently of ourselves. We think science projects a reality that is objective, by which it means a reality that exists independently of the observer, of ourselves. But the reality is no. That the nature of our relationship to the world is not that of a novelist writing a third-person narration, where, as it were, he is seeing his characters, he is seeing the events as if he were God from the outside of their experience. We can sort of imagine, situations like that, but that's not ever the reality, right? And that's not that perspective of attempting to see the world or imagining we can see the world from without, as I've said before, is actually the ultimate source, or one way to represent the ultimate source of human suffering. It's also a weakness in terms of our science, that the strongest scientific results, the results of Einstein in relativity theory and of Heisenberg in quantum mechanics, were achieved by attempting to describe the world from within, doing, as I've described it, the physics of existentialism, the physics acknowledging that we cannot see the world from without. We have to be able to describe it from where we stand. Well, and that gives the more powerful result. The best account of the confusion, the lack of clarity, of the enterprise that war presents is probably given by the American writer, the late 19th century American writer, Stephen Crane. Stephen Crane is one of the most gifted of all novelists. He wrote an account of the Civil War, actually an episode, a battle, minor battle, of the Civil War, the war that was fought in the United States between northern and southern states between 1861 and 1865. Stephen Crane had never been to war. He had not been a soldier. He had not seen actual fighting firsthand. Stephen Crane, nevertheless, in The Red Badge of Courage, this short novel, almost a novella, short novel, wrote what is considered one of the greatest of all accounts of war. Now, typically, such accounts by Tolstoy, for example, by Hemingway, by Norman Mailer, are written by people who actually participated, in some way, in combat or very close to combat. Not the case with Stephen Crane, who had a sufficient imagination, sufficient power of mind to understand the nature of warfare itself. And his account, we might almost say, is an epistemic one, an eye-level one. He's not depicting war, as it were, from the outside, from outside the world, from above and beyond the battlefield. He's depicting the encounters, the experiences of the people he's describing, his characters, as they were seeing them in the full confusion and terror and uncertainty of that experience. So, what I wanted to do, I selected some passages from The Red Badge of Courage, from the very beginning, the very end, and a couple, sort of somewhere in between, just to give you a sense of how he does portray this epistemic account, this eye-level account of the experience where he is immersed in it, and the lack of clarity, the confusion that becomes central, to the account as it's central to the actual experience of war, that comports with that notion that, again, no plan survives the encounter with the enemy. right? In the same way, war itself is profoundly a state of confusion and uncertainty as it's experienced. So here, let me share this. And I'll pull it up 1 second here. Okay. This is from the very beginning. And what we're really encountering here is what's often called the fog of war. That's the metaphor, that's the metaphorical description of it, the lack of clarity that is central, to the activity that, again, subverts blame, right, when somebody criticizes outcomes. The coal passed reluctantly from the earth, and the retiring fogs revealed an army stretched out on the hills, resting. Notice, retiring fogs, things are obscured. As the landscape changed from brown to green, the army awakened and began to tremble with eagerness at the noise of rumors, not certainties, rumors. Rumors are rife in war. Rumors are rife in any situation. Rumors are rife right now in Afghanistan, in any conflict situation. There's no clarity, there's no certainty, at ground level. Once a certain tall soldier developed virtues and went resolutely to wash a shirt, he came flying back from a brook, waving his garment banner-like. He was swelled with a tale he had heard from a reliable friend, who had heard it from a truthful cavalryman, who had heard it from his trustworthy brother, one of the orderlies at division headquarters. He adopted the important air of a herald in red and gold. He heard a rumor that was a rumor from somebody else. There's no clarity. The regiment fell back to the stolid trees. There it halted for a moment to gaze at some dark forms, just forms, not clear what they are. Dark forms that had begun to steal upon its track. There seemed to be mobs all about them, mobs of people not ordered, a mode of chaos. War is chaos, or the closest we come to it. The greater part of the men, discouraged, their spirits worn by the turmoil, the confusion, the turmoil, acted as if stunned. And from this consciousness that they had attempted to conquer an unconquerable thing, you don't know in advance, there seemed to arise a feeling that they had been betrayed. Right? You can't be sure of outcomes. However, the rear of the regiment was fringed with men who continued to shoot irritably at the advancing foes. The youthful regiment was perhaps the last, youthful lieutenant was perhaps the last man in the disordered mass, You see, the confusion, the uncertainty, the fog of war. It's a theme. And it's a theme in Crane, it's a theme in 19th century war, it is a theme today in war. The roarings that had stretched in a long line of sound across the face of the forest began to grow intermittent and weaker. They could see changes going on among the troops. There were marchings this way and that way. Again, disorder, confusion, lack of clarity. On the crest of a small hill was the thick gleam of many departing muskets. And that's how the novel ends. But the main theme of the novel is the lack of clarity at eye level. We imagine that a plan is clear, is transparent to us. We imagine perspective that's not available, in our actual experience of life, in our actual experience of war or conflict of any sort. So, Stephen Crane, Red Badge of Courage is one of the great masterpieces of American literature and of world war literature. Comparable in its psychological insights to a much longer work such as Tolstoy's War and Peace. So, just as the battlefield presents a lack of clarity, a persistent lack of clarity, just as any plan cannot reliably be executed because circumstances are always changing, well, outcomes are always unaccessible. We can't know for sure, what is in our best interest and what the outcome ultimately will be, and whether the outcome will be to our advantage or not. That's the nature of heuristic space, where there is no certainty. It's a point that the Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, made, I think in 1972. He was asked, this is the premier of China at the time, about 50 years ago, almost 200 years after the French Revolution. He was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? And his response, 200 years after the fact, it's too soon to tell. That captures, the circumstance that the future decides the past, and we can't know. And when it comes to decision making, I've made the point that we can't do the comparisons that we need to do to make rigorous decisions or to evaluate the outcomes of decisions rigorously. We can't follow one course of action, rewind in time, follow a separate course of action, and then compare the outcomes. But even if we could rewind in time, we wouldn't know when to stop the comparison. After 1 year, after 5 years, after 10 years, after 100 years, after 200 years. That's the point that Zhou Enlai was making. It's the same point that I've made before with the story of the 14-year-old boy who gets a horse for his birthday, and the Zen master who, as events unfold and people, the villagers applaud or decry, regret the outcomes, of that gift, the Zen master calmly, comments every time with each change in circumstance and fortune, we'll see. We'll see. The future decides the past, decides ultimately what's in our best interest, decides ultimately whether a course of action was justifiable or not. The French Revolution, 200 years hence, was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Well, the wise assessment, it's too soon to tell. The future decides the past and can alter any assessment that we've made at any point previously. It's the nature of the experience of time, and it's the nature of our conceptualizations and assessments in relation to time. So, history itself is not a definitive guide. There's a philosopher, George Santayana. He was actually a philosopher at Harvard. Let's take the time. We're doing okay. I have a photograph of what he looked like that I did not send to Aaliyah because I added this also after I outlined the talk. Here is George Santayana. Just so you see. Oh, I just want to show you. There is Zhou Enlai, okay, who made the comment about the French Revolution being too soon to tell. Here is a photograph of George Santayana. He's a Harvard philosopher. He focused especially on the nature of beauty, the philosophy of beauty, the philosophy of history. Bertrand Russell once commented that his writing style, Santayana's writing style, was so beautiful, so compelling that Russell had trouble following his thoughts because he was captivated by the beauty of his language. He said it was a constant distraction. And Santayana is known for probably the single most famous remark ever made about history and its significance to us. He said, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, rigorously, the simple fact of the matter is, even those who remember the past cannot reliably use it in new sets of circumstances. The past is never a definitive guide, it's only a suggestive guide. And when it comes to assessing the past, we can't ever, for example, when we want to maybe investigate what caused a certain historical result, what caused a certain outcome, what were the main factors that led to conflict, or the main factors that led to either positive or negative historical results as we currently see them. What we can't do is go back in time, alter any one of those factors, and see if we still get the same result years later. We cannot do controlled experiments with regard to historical phenomena. And what's really compelling, what's really important to take note of is, even if we could go back in time and alter the past to assess the new outcome in the face of different circumstances from the past, the result does not allow for a rigorous assessment, because the second time we go back is different from the first by it being the second. And when we're talking about philosophical rigor, when we're talking about the rigor that rises to the level of what religions aspire to in terms of a complete solution to the world here and now, any distinction matters. It's only at the limit of rigor that philosophy ultimately achieves its promise and its results. So history is, again, it's a heuristic. We can use it. Circumstances are always changing. And so we are never, when we're dealing heuristically, not epistemically, in a position to guarantee results. We're not wizards, right? We're not clairvoyant. We can't see clearly into the future. And we shouldn't blame people for not being wizards and not having that clairvoyant capacity that does not exist. I started out by saying that we were talking about, the talk was motivated by events in Afghanistan, but what I'm saying is, as you can see, applies to any type of conflict, any type of war. Even things that are not war, but are conflicts in other ways. A sporting contest is a conflict. When we are talking about conflict, we are talking about a convergent process, right? So conflict itself represents a form of convergence. So when we bring things together in a heuristic space, in a convergent space, we can achieve objects that are stable. We can achieve objects that are unexpected in terms of their properties. We can achieve explosions, depending upon what we are bringing together. Right? And again, every time we bring these ingredients together, because we're doing it in a different surround, the background, the environment is always different, and every difference matters or can matter, we may get a different result. Well, one of the common experiences of human societies historically is a convergence of cultures, right? In a sense, that's what characterizes most societies on Earth. Like the United States, for example, is seen as a melting pot. We have people from all over the world coming here and assimilating to this culture. There's been this, we occupy North America, it was settled by successive waves of Europeans originally, and people from other parts of the world. That represents a convergent process, but also implies or involves various modes of conflict. Conflict between native Native Americans and European settlers and subsequent settlers. That type of cultural collision, right, is a mode of convergence that can produce, again, all manner of results. Some of them desirable as evaluated, from certain perspectives, some undesirable, traumatic. We often hear talk about cultural relativism, that we shouldn't, like, we should respect other cultures. But we also have an obligation, right, to be true to our values when we are seeing, conflict or customs play out that might strike us as horrific. Right? We have a personal responsibility to say something, to do something, not just, we're not just watching the Holocaust and saying, well, that's how German society, German culture, sees the course of history. And we should allow them, that operation. We should allow them, to indulge themselves, with that playing out of a horror. No, we have human responsibilities to our circumstance, right? We're not seeing the world from the outside. We're seeing it from our perspective, and we're acting accordingly. There's a wonderful statement of cultural relativism and how to respond to it by a British commander, a British general, Napier, Charles James Napier, who in the 19th century was in India during the Raj, during the British colonial rule, over that country. And Napier encountered the phenomenon of the cultural phenomenon of Hindus burning widows after the death of their husband, that it was considered the custom, to burn widows so the widow would accompany the husband into the next life, or there are varieties of views on that supported that activity, that custom. Well, Napier was horrified by it, and he had an interesting and compelling response. What he said was, "You say it is your custom to burn widows. Very well. We too, British, have a custom. When men burn a woman alive, we hang them. Build your funeral pyre. Beside it, my carpenters will build a gallows. You may follow your custom, and then we will follow ours." That effectively ended the practice, or largely did. So again, we have a responsibility to our own sense of value of morality, but having that responsibility doesn't take the form of certain kinds of judgment, in the sense that it is our obligation, if we feel the practice is horrific, to say something, to do something, to controvert that practice. But at the same time, those people that were born into that society, into that culture, did not choose that birth, did not choose those societal patterns or cultural norms, in the same way that someone who is a serial killer, someone who is a pedophile. I mean, among the worst things to be in society are pedophiles and, I guess, serial killers. Certainly, pedophiles rank, high up in terms of, egregious, reprehensible behavior, right? But in general, people aren't recognize that these are not socially sanctioned impulses and activities, to indulge in serial killing, to abuse children. These are not admirable. These are not endorsed, accepted by the society. Right? So it's not that one would want to have those impulses. I don't have those impulses. I don't know what it is to even to feel those kinds of drives or temptations. In the Jewish tradition, in the Talmud, there's a recognition that not to have such an impulse, is a blessing, but you need to recognize that you don't know the nature of someone else's impulses. Now, obviously, we are going to protect society from those impulses. But protecting society from those impulses does not mean intellectually, philosophically judging, in the sense that you don't know the strength of someone's impulses. Even in the case of a serial killer. Maybe a serial killer has committed 5 murders, 10 murders. Maybe it was all he could do not to commit 100 or 200. Now, again, we don't condone the actions. We don't allow the actions. We do whatever is necessary to stop the behavior, to protect society. But in terms of the actual judgment, we didn't create those people. They didn't create themselves, in the sense that they didn't willingly embrace or want those impulses. Okay? So religiously, we hear over and over again the admonition, you shall not judge. Thou shalt not judge. Again, we have responsibility as a society not to permit the harm to others. But in terms of the actual intellectual, philosophical, moral judgment, there's a certain humility that we need to display. We did not, I have an aphorism, not having created oneself, no one deserves to suffer. Right? That we didn't choose our fundamental circumstances. People that are born in Afghanistan or in challenging environments and in challenging circumstances, for all we know, have preferred to have been born in more idyllic circumstances, on an island, in Hawaii, in Beverly Hills, where life is richer and not challenged in so many ways, so many horrific ways. But so humility is the ultimate philosophic stance. Humility in terms of judgment, of operations within heuristic space, right? But what's interesting is that philosophy, which embraces the most severe rigor, right, an incontestable rigor, uses it to enforce the most extreme humility. You shall not judge because you can't know another person's circumstances from the inside well enough to judge, to evaluate. Every difference matters rigorously. We hear, well, in order to make an assessment of somebody, you need to walk in his or her shoes. That's not good enough. You need to have been born into their skin and not to have been born in your own. That is an impossibility. Only that degree of assimilation that you are you never existed independently. That's the only identification that would allow judgment legitimately, because that's the only identification that will be able to assess all aspects, be able to embrace all aspects of that person's circumstance. And as I've written, in fact, it was an aphorism that closed my first book of aphorisms. As of the sparrow, everything matters. When it comes to judgment, everything matters. And you are not able to know everything about another's circumstance. Rigorously, philosophically, you are not in a position to judge. You're in a position to protect yourself, your society, assert your moral code, your moral impulses, protect society, protect others, stand against horror, abuse. But in terms of actual judgment, that's not your role, because rigor doesn't permit it philosophically, epistemically. Check here. There's I've addressed this before, and I think I'm going to close with a quotation from the books of Joshua, dealing with the case of Galileo, to make the point about philosophical humility, the fundamental humility of our circumstances that prohibits us from blaming, from judging. I've noted that Galileo was in conflict with the church, right? He famously was forced to recant his teachings about a sun-centered solar system that had displaced the Earth from the center of creation, the center of existence, which the church embraced, and Galileo had embraced the Copernican view of the solar system, where the Earth was in motion around the sun, right? Giving it a less central role in creation. We know now that both the church and Galileo were right or wrong, depending upon, they were wrong in their dogmatism, that each point at which you find yourself is, so far as we can ever say, the center. The world can be described with any given point as its still center, as an unmoving point. That's what Einstein's theory of relativity achieves. So there's a dogmatism, there's a lack of humility, in both the church's position and the position of Galileo, that led to a lot of mischief, a lot of suffering. Right? Philosophy enforces a humility that transcends dogmatism. And the lines from the books of Joshua go, Galileo claimed too much, as did the church, which likes to fuss, as did Galileo. And both would paint with too broad a brush. But the Talmud didn't rush and carefully considered why God delivered the 10 Commandments to a minor hill when a monumental majesty better fit the bill. And what did the scholars propose? That God chose modesty over majesty, because God inclines to humility. And so it need not mar creation, that the race rides a minor planet, truth to tell, a carousel, around an otherwise undistinguished star, earning by circumference a dizzying sense of what we are. The Talmud is a Jewish commentary on the Old Testament. And the Talmud, if the Talmud had been read by the leaders of the Catholic Church, they might have been introduced more strongly, more cogently to this principle of humility that the Talmud recognizes as central, to the encounter with divinity. The notion that it's okay for the earth not to be at the center, in the same way as it's okay for the Ten Commandments not to have been given to Moses on the tallest mountain in the region, because God prefers humility. Look at the example of Christianity. Jesus, Son of God, enters the world not as a conqueror, not as Alexander the Great. He enters the world as an impoverished carpenter. The New Testament, as the Old Testament, makes the point. It's humility that embraces the highest values of divinity. And the humility that philosophy enforces is the humility of rigor, that what we cannot rigorously know, we cannot pretend to know. And as I've been emphasizing from the beginning of these talks, the fundamental Socratic position, we suffer in every instance, in every direction, not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably, in every direction, about everything. And so we withdraw philosophically from the blame game. Okay, I think that is a good place to stop tonight's basic presentation. I have a question from last time. It has two parts. I want to address that. I remember it. Yeah, well, I think I actually remember it. The question is, what is my spirit animal and why? And what philosophical significance does that have? And I think I'll address it in terms of the philosophical significance that the concept of spirit animals might have. And I want to give actually something that struck me from a book that I've quoted from a number of times, referred to frequently, Anti-Memoirs by Andre Malraux. It begins with a reference to the concept of spirit animal in a way that immediately engaged my interest and attention. But first, I'm not totally sure my spirit animal, because to be honest, and this is, I think, typical of my approach to doing science, doing philosophy. It's an experiential one. I've had limited experience with the animal kingdom. Now, I happen to like wild animals. So it's not so much my preference to be, like around domesticated animals, like dogs or cats that have been acculturated, genetically acculturated, to our, human societies. I'm more interested in animals in the wild and learning, what I can from observing their behaviors. The wild animal that is closest to us, mammals, that we can observe during the daytime on a daily basis, turns out to be squirrels, right? And I think people that have followed these talks know that I am especially fond of squirrels. They are arboreal, they live in trees. We descended from trees. We have a lot in common with squirrels just because of that evolutionary ancestry. When one's living in trees, vision and touch are the two indispensable senses, the senses on which life and death most consistently depend. And in the case of squirrels, their vision and their sense of touch are especially finely developed. They're smart. They're able to run through trees, run along branches, like at incredible speeds, doing acrobatic maneuvers. That takes very rapid processing of information that they're receiving. That is a highly intelligent function. They engage in exemplary behaviors. They live in they're fairly solitary creatures. I am fairly solitary, so that engages me. They live in colonies of related or individuals that they're familiar with. When there's a threat that appears in the environment, it might be a cat, it might be a coyote, whatever the threat might be, the first squirrel to signal the threat, to sound an alarm. They have a characteristic sound that they make, a kind of a low-pitched clucking sound, to alert the other members of the community of this threat. Well, the first one that alerts the community is the last one to leave the community as the threat resolves. So they have a sense of altruism. I notice when I feed squirrels, and I feed them kind of on a daily basis, I have maybe half a dozen, 6 or 8 squirrels that come regularly. They typically will not eat all the walnuts that I give them. They'll leave a few pieces for the next squirrel. It's a pattern that I've observed. They're adaptable. They learn. You hear that squirrels are always burying nuts, right? For the winter months, when they're not going to have a lot of food available. Well, the squirrels that come to me know that they can rely upon me. And so they don't bury food. Or they might bury a little bit, but they're always leaving behind nuts. Okay? And I don't often see them carrying nuts away. They're eating the nuts where I feed them to them, and then they walk off. So they're also capable of engaging in other types of behavior that's considered like intelligent. They're capable of engaging in deceptive behavior. They may, if they feel that they're being watched by another squirrel, maybe even by a person, they'll pretend to bury a nut 4 or 5 times before they actually bury it in a location. Deceptive behavior is very unusual, in the animal world. So squirrels are intelligent. They are sweet. I've never been bitten by a squirrel. They come to me if I say it's okay, just those words. They have everyone a different personality. They'll approach in different ways. They'll have different characteristic behaviors that I can discern. They'll take food, in slightly different ways. So they have distinguishable personalities. They're solitary. I identify with that. They have the highest levels of cortisol. That's a stress hormone in their bloodstream that has been measured in animals. So they live stressful lives, difficult lives, and one of their main causes of death is starvation. So when I was introduced to squirrels by a neighbor like 5 or 6 years ago, and I began to appreciate their qualities, their characteristics, I said to myself, they will not starve to death on my watch. So as much as any animal would be a spirit animal for me, it would be the squirrel. Now, that's not to say that if I wasn't exposed to other animals, if I got to know them, as I've gotten to observe and become acquainted with squirrels and their behavior, there might be another animal that I would be drawn to. But in terms of my experience, it's the squirrel. Now, what are we doing when we're talking about that type of identification? We're considering a convergence, right? We're considering what animal might I pair with or might comport with me? What animal might I identify with? When we're talking about these kind of convergences, we're adding up features, elements, components, right? I've given a list of components, especially their solitary nature, their intelligence. I'm drawn to intelligent, human beings, intelligent creatures generally. I'm impressed by their altruism. So I can articulate a series of characteristics that draw me to them. They're cute, they're sweet, they're not aggressive, certainly not towards me. And so that's one of the ways that we make choices, right? In a heuristic space, we assemble the ingredients and we weigh them. I might consider the convergent element of squirrels, their behaviors, their characteristics, and compare them to such similar elements to some other species. And given the number of elements that appeal to me and the weight of those elements, how strongly I'm drawn to them, I will make a choice of one over another. So it's a convergent process that I'm engaging in, right? It's how we undertake decisions in every instance. There's an anecdote I wanted to tell you, and that's at the beginning of Antimemoirs, at the end of the introduction. Andre Malraux recounts a story involving the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, a student of Freud's, known for his study of archetypes and a different sort of mode of psychoanalysis than Freud had developed. And Malraux describes this encounter. I don't know if I can remember it verbatim, but more or less, I'll paraphrase it. Talks about how Jung had visited the Native Americans of New Mexico, okay, a tribe in New Mexico of Native Americans. And this was maybe, I don't know what year, maybe 100 years ago or more. Okay. And he met with the chief of the village, and they walked up a ladder to the second level of a dwelling, where the encounter, the meeting was going to take place, the discussion. And one of the first things that the leader of the tribe asked Jung was the animal of his clan or totem, his spirit animal, effectively. And Jung replied, well, he was from Switzerland. Switzerland has neither clans nor totems. So he dismissed it, right? Didn't embrace the concept of a spirit animal. At the end of the meeting, at the end of the encounter, the Indian chief goes down the ladder as we go down a flight of stairs facing away from the wall against which the ladder was leaning. Jung went down the ladder as we might facing it, right? Facing the ladder, facing the wall. When Jung got to the bottom of the ladder, the Indian chief goes over to him and silently points to the Bear of Bern, the symbol of Bern, the city in Switzerland, the Bear of Bern, embroidered on his visitor's jacket, on Jung's jacket. Turns out, according to Malraux, the bear is the only animal that descends a tree trunk or ladder as we do, facing it. So, that is actually how Andre Malraux ends the introduction to Antimemoirs. It was one of the first things about that book that I found compelling. Okay, so the point is that there are more things there's a line from Hamlet. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. So there's an instance of spirit animals in compelling literature. And do we... Oh, I think we're out of time. Do we have any questions? I mean, I can answer next time.
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much, Stephen, for being here with us today. Thank you for joining us weekly. Would also like to thank you, the audience, for staying active, for watching us from different types of social media networks. So far, we don't have really any questions, but you may also address them after the session. We will definitely address them next week. Please stay safe, have a great week, and thank you all very much for being with us. And thank you very much, Stephen. See you all next week. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alita. Bye-bye.